Hi, my name's Keith Cooper, and in this video I'm going to have a look at upsizing an old image, one that was taken with an 11 megapixel camera years ago, to a size that I can comfortably print at A2. Now A2 is a big print. An 11 megapixel image normally doesn't contain enough information to be able to print that size. Not always true. There are ways of enlarging images that I've looked at in the past. And what I would say is that there are loads of links in the description to this video to articles that go into all of this stuff in much more detail. And I've got links to other types of testing I've done and all other relevant information that hopefully will be helpful for anyone wanting to try this out themselves. One other bit I should say right at the start, I'm using Photoshop for this. I'm not using Lightroom. Personally, I don't like Lightroom. Lightroom is like taking your film to a lab to get prints made for you. Photoshop to me is like having your own darkroom. There's a world of difference. Now, I know some people like Lightroom, and there are aspects of this that this workflow that you could actually include in Lightroom relatively easily. But I'm going to show the examples here using Photoshop. Hopefully they're broad enough examples that you can adapt them to other images and whatever it is you actually want to print yourselves. Anyway, starting off, the image I'm going to look at was taken when I paid my first visit, I think, to this bit of the Oregon coast back in 2004. Now, at the time, I was using a Canon 1DS, an 11 megapixel camera, really good lens on it, one that I still use to this day for the images that I'm taking here. They were taken with a 70 to 200 2.8L IS lens. It's an excellent lens. The new ones are better, but I've never had enough use for it to warrant paying out the money to replace the original I've got. I was lucky, I got a good one. So the images themselves are of good quality, but they suffer from low resolution. Now, 11 megapixels is still pretty good, and I've made some great prints from this. I've exhibited large prints made from this camera in the past, but this was just walking along the beach. I can't remember where this was. This was probably Pacific City or Cape Coanda, somewhere around there. And I was still getting used to using the camera. And I took a photograph, and this is a smallish print of it. This is the one I'm going to use for the example of a seagull. The image itself, nothing special. It was really just getting the hang of it. I always liked the picture and how the seagull just happened to superimpose itself against the pattern in the cloud, and it just made a nice print that I liked the look of. Nothing special about it, but there are aspects of this image which apply to almost any image you might want to try and upsize. Now, I'll show other examples at the end of other types of images that I've upsized. So just because you don't have a picture of a single animal or a bird or whatever that you want to upsize doesn't mean this process is limited to just subjects like this. Even back in 2004, every photo I took was in RAW format, and I've kept all those RAW files, and it's been very worthwhile because RAW processing software has improved dramatically over the years. So the results I would get from an image that I had processed back in 2004 with the best software I could find in 2004 won't be up to the quality I can get out of a modern RAW converter. Now, the examples I show here are just using Camera Raw in Photoshop. In fact, for this particular example, it was done on CS6, so not even the most up-to-date version. So I'm going to show some aspects of RAW processing that I hope are useful in a general way for people wanting to see about making bigger prints. So there we go. Let's have a quick look at the image itself. This is the RAW file opened up in Camera Raw. And I can see that I took it at 1,000th of a second, f6.3, so yeah, fairly good there. Shouldn't be much movement. ISO 100 at roughly 200 millimeters at full length for that lens. It's a bit dark. Now, I was still getting the hang of this, and if I was to look at exposure today, I'd probably give it a slightly longer exposure. to get a bit more light in the image. But it's a perfectly good raw file. It can be processed perfectly well, and I've got no problems with that. There's the image itself, processed from the raw file. Nothing difficult to handle about it. There's a bit of shadow detail on the bird that I want to bring out, but mainly it's sharp detail here, not much detail in other parts of the image. Now, this not much detail in other parts of the image is an important thing, as I'll come back to later, when you want to print images and you want to give the perception of sharpness. Sharpness doesn't always have to be there, it is the perception of sharpness that counts in your prints. Now, there's the image. If I look at the original image size, I can see that it's 3000 by 3144 by 2096 pixels. That's not very big by modern standards. Even so, 11 megapixels on a full frame sensor, as this was the first camera with a full frame sensor. I used it for quite a few years. Even so, because I've got a good lens on the front and I've got a large sensor on it, the image is far better quality than you would typically get from, say, an 11 megapixel phone camera. Now, you can apply some of these techniques to phone camera images, but you need to take a bit more care with them because the camera in phone is doing an awful lot more processing going on to deal with the tiny sensors they have in phones. But here we go, this is just a normal image, it's 3000 by 2000 roughly. This would give me a print at 300 pixels per inch of about 11 by 7 inches. So not a big print, but it would give a perfectly good print at that size. Now, it's sharp to make a good print at that size, and if it's sharp to make a good print at that size, I'm usually fairly certain I can get a big print much larger. Now, at some point, I'm going to be testing a much larger printer than any of the ones I've got here at the moment. And at that point, I'm going to come back to this and look at resizing, sharpening, all kinds of aspects of how you process images when you want to make very big prints. Now, more megapixels helps. So I currently shoot with a Canon 5DS, that's 50 megapixels. That makes prints this size much easier to handle. Even so, they can still benefit from a bit of upsizing if I'm making large prints, or if I'm just cropping a section off a print. So I've got to enlarge it. I've got to sharpen the image as well at some point for when I'm printing it. What do I want to do? Do I sharpen the image? I'm going to say I process the image. Do I sharpen it and then enlarge it? Or do I enlarge it and then sharpen it? Now, I've done quite a few bits of testing with various software looking at aspects of this, and I found that when processing the raw files, it really does help if the first thing you do is turn off most, if not all, of the sharpening and noise reduction in the raw processing software. So you turn those sliders right down. Lens corrections, well, it depends. It depends on what the image looks like and where the detail is. I may want to turn off lens corrections and even chromatic aberration corrections entirely. Now, if you've got a lens that benefits from these corrections, and this one does, it's worth experimenting a bit. And I found that with this particular image, this particular lens, if I turned off the geometric lens correction, but kept the correction for chromatic aberration, it produced a slightly better quality image. Now, remember, at this stage, with the processing of raw files, small differences can make big differences further on in the process. So you're going to have to experiment with this. And this is one of those things where you need to experiment with different lenses, different cameras, whatever you want to use. There is no one size fits all. And that is why I never describe things like this as a sort of process, as a recipe that you follow to make big prints. If you were looking for a recipe to follow to make big prints, you might as well quit now, because you won't ever get one from me. It's always specifically covering principles, not necessarily the details. I'm using a Mac and I'm using an old version of Photoshop on it. So if I made it ultra specific, it wouldn't apply to most people. I much prefer to focus on the principles because every image is different. Now, I've got this image here. And the next bit I got, we'll just see what it looks like, that image there. here's some detail from the original image. It's not terribly sharp. There's quite a bit of fuzziness about it. I have turned off sharpening, but even so, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of detail in that image. Well, it turns out there's a lot of detail in the image. It's just how you process it. So if I go on to having a look at the original image and add some sharpening. Now, the tool I'm choosing to use on this is Sharpen AI from Topaz. Now, I've got lots of reviews of the Topaz Sharpen and Gigapixel AI, also from Topaz, which is what I use for resampling. I've got lots of reviews of those that go into all of this stuff in a lot more detail. Those are generally written reviews I've done because I can't do them easily as video because they need a lot of detail in them and I need to test things. I need to update things. So if you're interested in using these tools, check the links associated with the article. They'll take you to all the information you need to do. That works fine whether you're using Photoshop, Lightroom, Windows or a Mac. No problem there. In fact, for stuff like this, you might as well be using Affinity Photo, which is an excellent bit of software, not that expensive. If I didn't use Photoshop every day for my professional work, I'd seriously look at Affinity Photo. It's a nice bit of software. But anyway, I've used Photoshop for over 25 years, so I'm used to using it. Here's the image, and this is just applying a bit of sharpening. And it is a phenomenal difference in the detail it brings out of the image in this type of sharpening. Now, this is sometimes called smart sharpening. It's a bit more than that. It's using a machine learning process. It can take several minutes to process an image like this. Even on a moderately fast computer, it can take a while to process it. And I can clearly see that sharpening here of that raw image gives me an image with a lot more detail in it. However, I have to be a bit careful. I don't want to over sharpen it at this stage and introduce artifacts and sharpening problems, because then if there are sharpening artifacts produced at this early stage, those will be magnified by the resampling process. And the problem is when you magnify them with the resampling process, they can reach a point where they're visible in a print, and we don't want that. So you always have to back off a little bit, not overdo things too soon. So here's the image. This is the before-after sharpened version of it, and I'm just using normal sharpening here. Now, with this particular sharpening, I've got an option for cancelling camera shake. Now, even at 1,000th of a second, there may be a slight bit of camera shake because I'm wafting the camera lens about. It's got image stabilization, but even so, there may be a little bit. So I often find that using the stabilize, or that's the image shake cancellation, helps. I haven't turned the level of processing up too much. There are auto settings on this which you can experiment with, but really you may need, for a particular image, if you're making a big print, you may need to try 2 or 3 different options to see what they look like. What I would say, if you're curious on this, just crop a small section of the image and use that image for experimenting with, because it will process much faster. So you can whiz through this and you can get a lot more ideas of what works. Now, if I've now resized that sharpened image. Now, I go through in the article looking at this quite a few details of what I did, other options I tried, why I dismissed certain options and that. But in general, I'm now going to sharpen that image. Now, I'm using Gigapixel AI here to do the sharpening, and I'm doing a 4 times scaling, so that's making a very big print. Apart from taking longer, I don't actually lose anything with this, because in generating that extra detail, I've found that sending extra detail to printers makes no problem at all, and that detail can come through. And also that extra detail can come through as a form of sharpening that works well with printing. Now, this is something I'm going to come back to at some point and look specifically at this to see how different types of sharpening affect very large prints. But I don't have a very large printer here at the moment to be able to show it. And just showing it on a screen is one thing, but I actually want to be able to hold up some big prints and go, look, this is the difference it makes. Yeah, to actually see that it does that. But anyway, there is one version of it. Now this original one here, this is just resizing the original image. This second version is the sharpened image, basic sharpening, and I've resized that 4 times. You can see there's quite a lot of improvement there. And lastly, I have the version which has had the shake reduction sharpening, and it looks better. Now remember, we're looking at a small part, even on an A3 print. We're looking at a tiny part of the image. So don't get too worried about sharpening on edges and things. We can deal with that if need be at a later point. But there is so much more detail in the head of the seagull with this enlargement that this is the process I'm going to use for it. Now you might wonder, I said right at the start about should I sharpen and enlarge or enlarge and then sharpen. This is the result from enlarging and sharpening. I tried a few options and this is one of the best ones. It has massively sharpened and enhanced the noise in the image. The detail isn't there. No, I'm not going to be using that one at all, not that way. So I've got this sharpened image here. This is not the one I'm going to use. I'm going to use one of the earlier versions for it for when it comes to printing. We've got detail in the bird itself. What about in the sky? Now the sky has no fine detail. There may be edges to clouds and things, but edges to clouds are never that sharp. If I've got things in flat areas, a blue sky, light hazy cloud and the likes of that, they really do not need any sharpening at all. And one of the problems you can get in sharpening your image, and I hope this is visible when I cut it, inset it into the video, is that not only do we have some dust spots. Now cameras like the 1DS nearly 20 years ago, digital cameras were absolute dust magnets and they didn't have sensor cleaning on them. So you had to try and keep your sensor clean and then with a blower or something like that, try and get the dust off it, and every so often actually physically clean the sensor. Dust was an ongoing problem with digital. It has resurrected itself a bit in early mirrorless cameras, because with mirrorless cameras you're exposing the sensor quite often. There's no shutter in the way to protect the sensor from dust getting onto it, so you do have to be a bit careful when you're changing lenses. But anyway, there it is. More important than the dust, which is easily fixable in Photoshop, there are some fine blue lines, bluish, greenish lines running across the image. Now this is sensor pattern noise. Older images did not have sensors that produce such a clean output as modern sensors do. And the difficulty with that may not show in the original images, but the moment you start sharpening or doing anything much to them, all kinds of problems can appear in seemingly neutral flat areas of the image. It varies with sensor. The 1DS had known issues with this, issues that I worked around. I mean, I used it for about 4 or 5 years for professional work, never had a problem for it. It was a limitation occasionally, but not one that you couldn't get around. Still a great camera to use, you know, built like a breeze block. You know, the sort of camera that if anyone attacks you while you're using it, you can fend them off with it and the camera will probably be okay. It's an absolute brick, but yeah, a really reliable and nice to use brick. So anyway, we've got this problem here. As I say, I can edit out the dust spots. What about the problem with the other stuff? Now, if I look at this resized image, it's now up to 11,800 by 8,200 pixels. So that's a big-ish image. I don't know, a 4 times enlargement. So that's 4 times on each edge. So it's quite a big enlargement. If I'm printing this at a large size, A2 for example, it comes out at about 530 pixels per inch. Now that's a lot, but as I've said, modern printer drivers happily accept that. The days of having to size things to multiples of 300, 360, depending on what printer you're using and stuff like that, you really don't have to look at that and worry about it. Now, I've got articles and some videos that cover that, if that's something you've come across before. People say, oh, you should always print at a certain resolution. Yeah, maybe 15, 20 years ago, but not now. It really makes no reasonable difference whatsoever. So I've got this image. Now, I can resize the basic original image. I can resize that in Photoshop. I can just use a bicubic smoother or something like that. I can enlarge it, and all of this mush that I've found that appears in the detail is lost. It won't be there. The bird itself will also just be soft and featureless. But that doesn't matter because I've already got an image of the bird that is really sharp, which is the one I processed in Gigapixel AI. So I take my original image, process it in Gigapixel AI, get a new image. I found out exactly what size that one is, pixel size. I then take my original raw file, open it again, process it, enlarge that in Photoshop using one of the ordinary dumb resampling methods that's perfectly adequate, it's worked well for years, and I get an identical sized image but much softer. It's not much softer, it just doesn't have lots of extraneous detail added into it. But I do want that extraneous detail in the bird. So what I end up doing is masking the layers together. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of how to do masking on Photoshop and things like that. It's a basic process. But literally I have the background layer, which is the image resized in Photoshop. I then have the sharpened layer, which is dropped on top of it. I then use a mask to paint in where I want the sharpness. So I paint in the sharp image of that. Now, so I've got some other photos of different examples, different types of photos that I've used this process on. In case you're thinking, well, that's a lot of trouble. Where would I use this on a normal photo with detail all over the photo? I'll come back to that. But for this specific example, and this is one of the reasons this is not a generalized sort of menu of a recipe of how to do things, because it varies. The key to doing this well is to keep looking at what you're producing and remember that it's for a print. It's not to look good on screen, it's for a print. So I've masked in, I've added layers here, and I've actually masked this stuff in to try and make it better. Now, one of the things I do is add a slight curves adjustment to lighten the seagull, because there's detail under the wings that's there that I want to make a little bit more obvious in the print. I just want to lighten it. This is the equivalent, the good old dodging and burning in the darkroom. And here is the actual mask viewed on its own, where I've brushed in some lightening onto the image just to make it a bit lighter. So where the mask is light here is where I've brushed in some lightening effect with a curves adjustment layer. Just a simple curve, just expanded upwards like that to just lighten the image a little bit. And I've brushed that in just to get the contrast of the bird looking the way I want it to look. So if I look at it now, the next one has got the image, and there's the image after it's had a little bit of brightening added in. Now the whole idea is masking in that brightening is quite subtle. If you can see it in this image, then I've messed up, because I don't want to show where I've added effects. I want it to look perfectly natural. And that's what I've got here. So I've also added, just as well as that bit of lightening, I've added a slight vibrance boost. So this is a bit more subtle than just cranking up the saturation, just to make the intensity of the blue sky a bit deeper. I've done that. So I've just cranked that up. It has no real effect on the seagull, which is effectively black and white, but the sky, it brings up the contrast to the sky a bit. I've then gone for, to finish it off, before I'm going to think about printing, I've gone for a levels adjustment. So and I'm working in 16-bit here. I've moved the black point up a bit to make the blacks just a little bit blacker, and I've moved the white point down to bring up the brightest bits in the image so that they're almost white on the paper. I've just moved it down a little bit. I've just stretched the range, the dynamic range of the image a little bit just by using a levels layer. And that's something I apply to it here. I don't want any clipping. I want everything nicely kept even. So I've got this image here. You can see the histogram where I've just moved the adjustments a bit. So what are the results? I then have to print this image. Now, turns out the print is the really easy bit because I think, if I remember rightly, I printed this one in Epson print layout. Or I might have printed it direct from Photoshop. It doesn't really matter. I've got a paper and a profile, and here is an A2 size print. Now, this is a crop from the original as well. So I could print this much larger. There's detail in it. If I look at this, there is detail. Where I've lightened things up, I can see the bird's eye. It's a juvenile herring gull, I think it is. It's a gull of some sort. And it's just, I like it as a nice picture. I've produced this one purely as a result of because I like the picture. This is not produced for any particular reason. It's not one of my commercial images. For my commercial images, I will sometimes do this, but you can rest assured if I need to do this much work, somebody's going to pay for my time in Photoshop. If it's a commercial image, I don't work for nothing. If it's for my own benefit, well, I'm doing it for my own benefit, and that does make a difference. So there we have the image printed actually on canvas. So it's a little dull in comparison to the print here that's printed on a Barita style paper. It's a little dull looking on that, but we've got the original image. Now, I'm just going to finish off with some other images. Now, these are also, some of these are covered in articles, whether they be the reviews or not. So here we have an image, black and white image. This one, this was a view of the Tetons, just poking out through a gap in the clouds on a snowy day. The sharpening on this one is almost entirely associated with just this area of the image here. In fact, if you look at the details of this in the review that I've got and the articles about making the image, you'll see more details of the kind of noise and stuff that can appear when you apply some smart upsampling software. You have to be on a lookout when you use this software. It's really good, but you do have to be on the lookout for artifacts that you don't want. So there we have mountains, and of course all the detail is in the mountains, not the clouds. And another sort. Here we have a view of some aspens taken in Colorado. This one, the image was taken with a 21 megapixel sensor, and I've enlarged it up to get detail in the aspens, so that even when I look quite closely, I can see more detail on the trunks of the aspens. I've needed to process the colour a bit. I've had to crank the colour up and shift it about a bit to get the right look for the picture. But that's the sort of thing that comes from normal editing experience of your photos. Nothing special to do with the enlargement here. The enlargement was purely about maximising detail in these trees so that they looked like trees and they didn't look like over-sharpened sticks. As I say, you always have to go back and check your images that you haven't overdone something. And it does mean going over the whole image, whether it be for detail in this one or other images like that with skies in them, looking for dust spots and the likes of that. So there we have it. One final bit to show the difference between the 2020 sharpened image, because I did this particular test a few years ago, and the best I could manage in 2004. This is from a file that I printed at A3. When I look at it in comparison to the file here, they're almost like two different images. This one has noise in it. The sharpening halo you wouldn't actually see on that because that would be lost in the printing. But this one here is just so much sharper, so much detail. And they are from exactly the same raw file. So when I say software has improved dramatically. Now, I hope that's of interest, hope it's of use. Please do ask questions, follow the links in the description, and if it's of interest, then I'll do a few more articles like this looking at aspects of image processing. Thank you. Oh, and please do subscribe to the channel. I always forget that one. Thank you.